So I was thinking of maybe calling the local police department today to tell them that I feel like I've been burglarized. And they would probably ask me, well, is anything missing? And I would say, not that I can exactly see, but I really have the strong sense that burglars have been in my house and have taken things. That, of course, is essentially the rationale adopted by President Trump and his legal team. They have not really started with any evidence. They don't have any evidence. Trump just sort of feels like he won the election, and they have to go and find some rationale for supporting that. Well, what is that doing to our democracy? What is that doing to our unity? I think you know, but we'll talk to Frank Rich in just a second about that. A little bit later, we'll talk to Michael John Winters, a columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, about the fact that we have for the first time ever, a Roman Catholic black cardinal, which may be significant also just in conjunction with having Joe Biden as president-elect, a guy who kind of makes no secret of his passion for his Catholicism. You kind of wonder if that whole social gospel thing is going to get really tried out here for the first time in a long time. We'll also talk about the NFL, which is rolling the dice with COVID-19 and having both successes and failures. All right, joining us now, as I said before, Frank Rich, writer at large for New York Magazine, executive producer for the HBO series Succession, so many other things as well, and a longtime friend of the show. Frank, good to have you back on.
Good to hear your voice. Great to talk to you, Colin.
So I already know your answer to this, but I'll run it anyway, just for a theatrical sake. I mean, there's sort of, you can do a glass full, glass empty scenario right now. Glass full is, we're not Chile. We had somebody make a very strong challenge to our institutions, and ranging from your local registrar of voters and poll moderator all the way to some of the appellate courts around the country, things seem to be holding pretty true. And we should feel good about that. We should feel good about the reinstitution of some kind of civic competence in the White House when Biden gets in. The glass half empty, which I know is where you're going to go, is that we are more damaged really than we even realize, that there's some fundamental damage to our ability to function as a civil society that is running very, very deep and won't be eradicated by the disappearance of President Trump. You have the floor.
Well, yes, I guess I am a sort of glass half empty kind of guy. I would frame it slightly differently. Look, there is a positive side. The system is held. It's widely believed to be perhaps the most accurate national election in history. There are Republican office holders at the state and local level who stood up to this lunatic and his schemes. And there are also judges, some of them appointed by Donald Trump himself, that have taken a very hard line and reacted contemptuously to these fictive, frivolous lawsuits that have been trying to destabilize the election results. But I feel the most alarming thing is not so much even the permanent damage this might do or the temporary damage this might do in undermining institutions. All Trump has done for 4 years now. This is just the latest example, but it does show us that the fact is that there's 70 million people in this country who voted for him, and the overwhelming majority of them are happy to believe in a fictional presentation of reality. And so, we've seen it knows no bounds. It's gone way past the stage of he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. Literally, he is ratcheted things up to such an extent that Republican office holders in places like Georgia are having their lives threatened, their families' lives threatened. Conservative Republicans in public office, and these people don't care. They want to believe whatever big lie Trump is selling this week, and that is something that cannot be fixed even instantly, and it's going to take a long time. And one positive thing of all that Trump has done is he's revealed many of the fissures in the federal government and places where things have to be shored up, because he found every loophole and crevice and in terms of just law enforcement within the federal government, within the White House. That can be enacted by legislation over time, and one hopes will be. But this psychological run or psychotic run that, almost half the country has been on is devastating. And there's nothing to suggest it will stop.
Yeah, I will just offer an anecdotal and small sample size addition to that, which is that, so over the weekend, I read a column for Hearst newspapers here in Connecticut. I wrote a column kind of advising Trump on how to pack and where to get boxes and stuff, and, whether he needs a dumpster, and wove through it some of the challenges he faces and how he might want to do a kind of Jason Bourne thing. And Melania opens up a moped shop on Mykonos or something. And, I didn't really think it was particularly small-minded or wounding, and I'm pretty used to how readers react to these things. I was really surprised by the number of Trump supporters who were furious at me in a way that they typically haven't been. And Frank, I do think one difference is, if you're a Trump supporter and he's in office, you can brush off certain kinds of criticism about, whether he's corrupt, whether he's temperamentally unsuited for the job, because he's got the job. And I do think, to your point, when he's out of that job, people are going to be surprised at the level of spleen they encounter in just sort of his grassroots supporters. But your thoughts?
I agree. And in fact, some time ago, well before the election, I wrote, a couple of years ago, Trumpism after Trump, if he loses, is going to be very, very angry because, first of all, they want to believe it was stolen, he was robbed, it was a hoax, and so on. But also, they don't have him in the White House anymore, and they have a figure in Biden whom they can't quite really turn into the enemy they want to turn him into, but not because of his centrist politics, just because he's a bland figure. He just does not seem like someone who's going to head a satanic pedophile, conspiracy, the kind of stuff that's sold by QAnon and others. So that spleen, as you said, that bile is going to turn in on itself, and it's going to be ugly. And we don't know what form it's going to take. Quite honestly, I do think that there's a new generation of Republicans who are happy to ride this wave and want to ride it, and whose views have been in line with Trump since he took office, whether it be Tom Cotton or Ted Cruz or Nikki Haley or Pompeo or any of these bootlickers of his in the Republican Party. But they don't have what he had as a performance artist. And I'm not saying that performance art I enjoy Trump's ever, even before he was in politics, but they're not going to be able to sop up, I don't think, that anger and express it the way he could. He'll keep trying to do it himself, of course, or whatever vehicle he chooses, which I'm sure will be a money-making vehicle because he has to find new grifts very fast because of all his debt. But he's not going to last forever, and this is going to be really ugly and beyond, in some ways, the reach of electoral politics during these 4 years.
Frank Rich, I want to give credit where credit is due. And Before Succession, you're, of course, executive producer of Veep. Like everything, a long time ago, you told me that when Veep would go to Washington, people would come up to you guys and say, how did you know? How did you know about that thing that you thought you had made up because it was so preposterously exaggerated? People thought that you were eavesdropping on conversations you weren't supposed to know about. So let's hear Selina Myers at the end of one of her runs for office.
News from Nevada.
What?
The new votes are tilting heavily toward O'Brien. Apparently, most of them are military absentees.
Of course, Fort Dutton. It all makes sense.
No. That doesn't make any sense. Nevada is my state. I'm going to be president. I'm going to be the first elected lady president. I'm going to have a lovely inauguration. Billy Joel is going to sing. So you guys have to stop the recount.
I'm sorry, what?
Stop the count.
Right.
Shut up, Gary. Ma'am, we can't.
I don't care.
The train has very publicly left the station and derailed at high speed.
No, yeah, stop the count.
Ma'am, this would look like a size 14 flip-flop. We really can't.
I don't give a You're going to cancel this recount like Anne Frank's bat mitzvah.
Yeah, I'm on it.
All right. So
I think this was written 3 years ago,
Yeah.
At least. We're very glad that we got out before the last. We got out, a year and a half or so ago, because we couldn't top what's going on now that we have seen repeatedly, our shows reenacted in the past year by Trump and his minions has been just mind blowing. And Dave Mandel, the showrunner of Veep, said to me, and talking a couple of weeks ago, our show is more relevant now, more timely now than when it was on air, which is probably true. But we couldn't top it. And when you see something like Four Seasons Total Landscaping, that fiasco, I don't know if someone tweeted that's better than Veep. Maybe it is. I don't know if we could have come up with something that preposterous next to a porn bookstore and a crematorium. I mean,
well, no, it felt very Veep though. I mean, there were a lot of sequences in Veep where the groundwork wasn't done appropriately, and she was showing up in places she didn't mean to be. So no, I think you can probably claim that one as well. I want to talk about the fact that there's sort of the question of, okay, let's say that. As I think both of us think, we have a real problem, and it's sort of a grassroots problem. It's how almost half the country perceives something as opposed to how the other half perceives it. And I guess, one of the questions is, what kind of restoration can you do in a situation like that? As you've suggested, people like Ted Cruz and Pompeo are probably going to try to stage a candidacy in 2024 based very much on Donald Trump's scripts. And that's assuming that he doesn't run in 2024. But meanwhile, the problem, as you suggest, seems to exist on a much more personal level. And I don't know how you go about rehabilitating the consciousnesses of that many million people.
I have to say, I don't know either. It feels like a cult that has to be deprogrammed, but obviously we can't do that. You constantly read, there's a kind of brand of centrist op-ed column that you and I read where this has been going on really since the publication of Hillbilly Elegy. Just talk to those people. Everyone should just get together and talk. We should meet in the diners in Pennsylvania and share our differences and come, have this sort of come to Jesus or come to unity moment. But that's nonsense. That's not going to happen. And people on the left are angry too. I think it's a more traditional form of anger that may actually be to some extent quenched if there are reforms in a Biden administration and ensuing Congress that fix some things at the policy level. But everyone is just in a rage. And my biggest hope, frankly, is that Biden is so boring. And I'm not saying this pejoratively. He is boredom personified, boredom in its best sense, and that you feel, a good uncle is sort of in charge of things. A lot of other people will be involved in doing the work. He's not going to be at you, every other moment on Twitter or on the air. And maybe that cooling off provided, it's like putting a wet blanket or a warm blanket on top of the country for a couple of years will have an effect. But that's probably over optimistic and simplistic. But that's sort of my main hope right now, that people say, hey, I sort of like this. We don't have to listen to a president yelling at us or riling us up every 10 minutes. And also while Trump will stage rallies, I'm sure, with ticket prices that are high and VIP, add-ons and all of that to make money, his ratings are not going to be what they were as president. The number, it is going to be a smaller number. It's going to be more like a Sean Hannity number or a Rush Limbaugh number, which is large by the standards of, our industry, but small in terms of the American public. And maybe there'll be a cultural change, but I just don't know.
Another problem with this, of course, and it's a problem that you've written about for decades, is the problem with the press itself and how it covers Trump, and particularly the degree to which there's been just this, very, very dichotomous fork in the road where the mainstream press has gone in one direction and everybody else has, or the conservative press has gone in the other. And so this past weekend, the president gave his first post-election interview on Sunday to Maria Bartiromo on Sunday Morning Futures on Fox News. It was a 45-minute bizarre, rambling performance in which she on no occasion asked him for proof or in any way questioned his version of reality. It made me think of a famous quote from Jamie Kirchick of the Brookings Institution, who said years ago, "Everything Trump says makes sense when you just preface it with, 'Donald from Queens, you're on the air.'" So let's hear how that sounded on Sunday.
They were saying he must be a great campaigner because he lost here, he lost here, he lost here, and he won the election. If a president, and this is over a long, many period, hundreds of years, 100 years or something, they went into all of the elections. If you win one of the 5 points, I won all 5. If you win one of the 5 points, you become president. You automatically, sitting president gets reelected. I won all 5 and I still lost. There was only one reason for that: fraud.
So, Frank, there's, as you've seen, I'm sure this morning, this is sort of a rambling kind of primary process stream of consciousness thing that it's even hard to understand what point he's making, something to do with an article in the Federalist, apparently. But, there's also been a pretty big backlash in the press against Bartiromo for enabling this and allowing this to happen. And I'm wondering whether you think that can be particularly effective, or have we kind of retreated to opposite corners in a way that what Brian Stelter says about Maria Bartiromo just kind of doesn't matter?
I think it doesn't matter. I do think, first of all, she's not working for a legitimate, she's working for a propaganda organization, not a news organization. Propaganda organization with some feints and news. I think that's hopeless. I also feel, in case of the whole Murdoch empire, that he will do, or his son will do, whatever is going to make money, and so that's what's going to drive them. And we don't know where that's going yet. It's been fascinating looking at the New York Post every day, and to some extent the Journal, and very rarely do I look at Fox News, but reading about Fox News. A lot of it's turned on a dime now. Suddenly, if you picked up this morning's New York Post, it's sort of completely respectful treatment of Biden, even his foot injury, which is the kind of thing that they would have made into a scare front page headline a month ago, burying a lot of Trump's nonsense and about his legal fight and his bogus views of the election. So there is a market element at work with that to some extent with Fox, but otherwise, press criticism of real news organizations should continue. None of them is flawless, as we know, but I don't know what effect it has. One thing I feel writing opinion pieces, and I've started to feel for 2 years during Trump, is, what are we doing it for exactly? And if you're writing for a place like New York Magazine or the New York Times or the New Yorker or the Washington Post, who are you really going to persuade? What Trump voter are you really going to persuade? And, for days on end, the Times op-ed page will have 4 pieces of, saying the same thing. And we all agree with it. And some of them are well done. Some of them are less well done. But I just, the press is a factor in this. I don't know. It's very beleaguered. It's been really under attack, not just by Trump, but by the whole real fake news industry, if we can call it that, and disinformation industry, and particularly in social media, but also in places like Fox and Newsmax and the rest. And I don't know. Another way to look forward is, what if, this is unlikely, but what if Biden, particularly with this Congress, but what if Biden actually does lead on things that help narrow inequities in this country, economic as well as class and racial? Might that have an effect? Might that win people over the way, in essence, the New Deal did, even though it will never be on that scale? But again, that's an optimistic hope. It's not necessarily based on what's really going to happen. We could be facing just years of gridlock.
Right. But I don't think it's a totally vain hope either. And, you look back to the Affordable Care Act, which ultimately people liked. They hated Obamacare. They liked the Affordable Care Act. That was because they didn't get anything in the mail that said Obamacare. They got something in the mail for the Affordable Care Act, which really did help them with stuff like pre-existing conditions. So to that point, if Biden could do a public option or something like that, yeah, maybe that's a win that becomes meaningful.
Yes, and look, these same people hated Social Security when they thought the government was running it, and then when they forgot that the government was running it, they liked it again. Remember, keep your government's hands off my Social Security. No, and I'll say this about Biden: he ran a really smart campaign. I found it very reassuring. He was being dissed when the campaign was being dissed for not putting him out more, all sorts of things. Being in the basement. It was a plan. Part of it was a practical plan. But if he had gotten sick and had COVID symptoms, it would have been the end of his race, I think. And so they really had to protect him. But beyond that, the choices so far, whether one agrees with all of them or not, or agrees with the policies of all of them for the cabinet, they're kind of shrewd adult choices of people who might Janet Yellen, who might actually get something done. So I'm heartened by that, and maybe we can look a little bit more optimistically that there will be a public option, that there will be an infrastructure program that will put people to work, that there may be something involving college debt. Certainly that's his motivation. Certainly Biden is not in it for personal glory or a future career. So it's interesting. We've never had a president this old before. And with this much on the line, and maybe we're going to have another surprising turn in our history, just like the last one, the unfortunate surprising turn we've just had.
All right, you got to go, Frank Rich, I happen to know, but in 15 seconds, when are we getting Succession back? Let's talk about the important thing here.
We started shooting 2 weeks ago in New York, to our amazement, with lots of testing, lots of COVID precautions. Knock wood, it's going well. We could be interrupted. If we're not interrupted, we hope, late summer of 21, fall 21. We have a lot to do, but I'm feeling optimistic about that for the first time in a year. So that's 8 months anyway. So that's a plus.
Yeah, that's a glass half full, admittedly in the world of fiction rather than fact. But as we know, the two of them tend to catch up and merge. Frank Rich, so great to talk to you. Great to hear your voice.
Great talking to you, Colin.
All right.
Take care.
He's got to go. I got to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk to one of our formidable commentators on American Catholicism, maybe our most formidable commentator on American Catholicism. We have a new black cardinal, which is a first. And we have a president who is openly passionate about his Catholic faith. Haven't had something like that in a long time either. So what's that going to add up to?
You won't listen, you always stay and stay. How can I miss you and you won't go away? I mean it too.
All right, we are back. We're going to talk now to one of our regular guests, Michael Sean Winters, is a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter and a fellow at the Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion in Public Life at Trinity College. We have a lot to talk about, including, in fact, a new cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church. So, Michael Sean Winters, welcome back to the air.
Good to be with you, Colin.
So let's talk about that. First of all, just kind of tell us a little bit about Wilton Gregory, who was the Archbishop of Washington and became the first African-American cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church here in America.
So Wilton grew up in Chicago. He was raised as a Protestant, but he went to Catholic schools, and there he decided he wanted to be a priest. And the pastor pulled him aside and said, well, before you become a priest, you have to become a Catholic. And so he became a Catholic and a priest. He was very, very bright, rose quickly, was a protege of Cardinal Joseph Bernardin, who in the 80s and 90s was the real champion of kind of a more engaged, more moderate Catholicism, not the kind of culture war Catholic version of Jerry Falwell that we got in the first decade of the 21st century. He became a bishop very young, age 36. was elected president of the Bishops' Conference, was the president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference during the meltdown and the sex abuse crisis in Boston in 2002, and really, corralled the bishops into coming up with what we know as the Dallas Charter for the Protection of Children, which really, wrapped our hands around. From that point forward, most of the revelations are from abuse that happened in the 70s or 80s or early 90s. And you don't have a lot of abuse after 2002. He was then Archbishop of Atlanta for many years, was a candidate to come to Washington the previous time it had been open in 2006. Washington, being a majority Black city. But then in 2019, he was finally brought up to Washington, and the Pope decided to make him a cardinal. I don't think it was surprising, given that really illustrative career. But given two things that happened this year, one was the kind of sense of a national reckoning with race this summer. And secondly, you may recall when President Trump crossed Lafayette Square to St. John's Episcopal Church and held the photo op with the Bible. The next day, he was scheduled to go to a Catholic venue owned by the Knights of Columbus. And Wilton denounced the Knights for hosting him in very public terms and said this was incomprehensible given the president's behavior. And in light of all of that, the Pope still went ahead and made him a cardinal. So I think the Holy Father has showed his political hand a little bit.
Well, the Holy Father's beliefs and values, as they tend to be in that particular office, are on the table and a matter of record. And he's been saying straight along that he sees the mission of the church and the mission of Christ in maybe broader terms than the church has sometimes construed them, that it has to be more about than just issues of marriage, issues of sexual orientation, issues of reproduction, that it's bigger than that, that it involves the poor in a very, very significant way. It involves economic and environmental justice. And so should we see Wilton Gregory as a choice that kind of not only reinforces that statement, because in fact a subset of American bishops have really kind of pushed back against Pope Francis on some of this, but also maybe as predictive of a way in which some of these issues might get engaged here in this country by the church more than they have in years past?
Certainly. I think, Wilton Gregory is part of the Pope Francis wing of the church here in the United States. There were others, but he's the one who's going to be in Washington, right? He will become Joe Biden's pastor on January 20th. And so that really puts him in the catbird seat to be the public face of the Catholic Church in dealing with politicians, right? The president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, Jose Gomez, the Archbishop of Los Angeles, is not the most effective leader. He's in Los Angeles. There's time zone differences. I would look for Wilton to be the real face and voice of the Catholic Church in dealing with the administration, but also more generally in commenting on politics. And in addition to the list of issues that you mentioned that are of concern that this Pope has highlighted, obviously, he has a unique perspective on race, being the first African American, though, obviously not the first Black cardinal, because Africa has had, 30 or 40 cardinals.
So since you just alluded to whose pastor he's going to be, let's talk a little bit about how that ties in, too. I mean, it's difficult to know with Biden being president-elect right now what it's going to mean. But it means something to have an American president who is unabashed about the role that Catholicism played in his life, as opposed to, say, a John Kerry who might try to dial things down a little bit. So as you look at that, there does seem to be kind of an interesting intersection. Pope Francis's beliefs, Wilton Gregory's emergence in this way, and in this particular geographic spot, and then the arrival of Biden. When you look at Biden, I don't know, what role do you expect to see his religion playing in how he acts as president?
Well, you got to dance with the girl that brought you, and his campaign was very explicitly leaning into his faith. First, as a biographical fact, right? I mean, obviously, his faith played such a role in overcoming the sense of loss when he lost his wife and his daughter, and then when he lost Beau. I mean, these are are areas of humanity where we can connect, and where if faith was not a part of the story, that would seem strange to people. But he did, do more than that. It's not just this kind of personal understanding of faith. It was interesting, even back at the eulogy he gave for George Floyd's funeral, he mentioned, I was raised in Catholic social teaching, and faith must be manifested in works. Let's not be clear. He's not the president of Catholic America. He's the president of all America. He's pro-choice. He's not opposed to abortion rights as the church teaches. So it's not down the line that he's going to govern as a Catholic president. But I do think, there's 2 points to this. One is the way in which Joe Biden, both as a candidate and I think as a president, is going to be what we could call a cultural Catholic. He shows up late to mass. He may leave a little early, but he's always there. He's a real B+ Catholic, I think, at the very least. He's cares about religion. I don't know that he can, cite line and verse of papal teaching on that issue. But everybody knows someone like Joe Biden if you're Catholic. Everybody has an uncle who's like Joe Biden. He's a good guy, and he's pretty straight shooting, and he cares about people. He's got this incredible empathy. Now, how does that extend over into the challenges of particular issues? We'll see. I do think the pandemic is going to has first of all demonstrated the limits of libertarianism in a way nothing else has in my lifetime, and really calls forth a remaking of the economy in ways that lean into the more communitarian Catholic understandings of social life. For Catholics, the first goal of politics is not the preservation of individual liberties. It's the attainment of the common good, of which, preserving individual liberties is a part. But the common good theme, I think you will see Biden hitting again and again and again. Will his faith go as far as I would like, and to maybe see it challenge the kind of cultural sense of meritocracy that we have in this country? Listening to Frank Rich, he mentioned, college loan forgiveness. And I can't believe Democrats still have not learned to say, we want to forgive college loans, but here's first the program that we're going to do for the kids who don't go to college. Mm-hmm. And they wonder why they lose in large parts of America, where people are like, so I'm going to pay for that kid who got ahead by going to college. I've got to pay for it, even though my kid isn't getting ahead. Will Biden's faith lead him to challenge that kind of cultural presumption? And I think that's probably a bridge too far.
Well, although it's an interesting question, and the way that you just framed it, I can't imagine that it would fall entirely on unsympathetic ears if you put it that way to him. And it does seem as though we've been through, I think, 4 years of leadership that, although occasionally President Trump would invoke some moral source, although never very persuasively, some kind of, spiritual or moral pole star by which he was steering. Again, very rarely and unpersuasively, at least to me. It'll be interesting, I think, in the way that you're talking about, if Biden begins by articulating a set of principles. 4 years ago, we had a speech about American carnage at the inauguration. I mean, it seems like maybe that's where it all begins. Michael Sean Winters, as you think about listening to his inauguration, are there specific things that you're hoping he will say that signal the kind of thing you just talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I would look back to the Democratic National Convention, where for 4 nights he controlled the message, and I'd also point to some research by Lee Drutman, who, looking back at the 2016 election, kind of classified people on. We say, oh, someone's progressive, and he said, well, are they progressive on economic issues or on social issues? And he charted it, and obviously, people who are progressive on both are the core of the Democratic Party. People who are conservative on both, core of the Republicans. And then, but those who are liberal on social issues, but conservative on fiscal issues, the kind of, Michael Bloomberg world, that was like 3.8% of the population. But those who are a little more conservative on social issues, but liberal on economic issues, what I would call the Pope Francis voters, That's like 28% of the population. So there's a real easy way for the Democrats and Joe Biden to become the majority party. Unfortunately, the kinds of people who work on campaigns, who run polling outfits, who staff Congress and the White House, they come from elite institutions that tend to prioritize cultural liberalism over economic liberalism. So there's that built-in tension within the Democratic Party. I think you saw it was a remarkable thing at the Democratic Convention. For 4 nights, the word abortion was not mentioned once.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in 2012 at the Charlotte Convention, it was abortion palooza, right?
Yeah.
And that was by design.
Mm-hmm.
Can you sustain that over 4 years of a presidency? I have my doubts.
We're going to have to leave it on that question mark right there. Michael Sean Winters, columnist at the National Catholic Reporter. Great to hear your voice again, too. It's Old Home Week on the show today. We'll take a little break here. Thanks to Kat Pastor for producing at the studio. Thanks to Betsy Kaplan for producing this episode. We'll be back with, of all things, the NFL.
My heart with delight. That's Saturday night. I ride believing from home. Find every step inside St. Peter's Dome. Claustrophobic and ex-Catholic. That's Saturday night.
So for people like me who were big fans of the television sitcom, if that's the right word, The Good Place, any story involving Blake Bortles, a quarterback in the NFL, is inherently funny. Well, that was tested this past weekend. Bortles was one of 4 quarterbacks on the roster of the Denver Broncos, all of whom were not available. And that is because of COVID exposures, in one case because of a positive test. And that is very symbolic, I think, of the kind of trouble the NFL seems to be veering into. Here to tell us more is Ken Belson, who covers the NFL for the New York Times. Ken Belson, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me on.
So there's a way in which the Broncos' dilemma, I mean, it was sort of weird enough to be intriguing, that they, I guess counting their practice squad, had 4 quarterbacks. They couldn't use any of them. If it were for some other reason, it would have been kind of a little bit funny and maybe a little bit fascinating. This, however, seemed more nervous-making than anything else.
Well, it was symbolic of 2 things. One is that the entire NFL enterprise this season has relied on the honor code, which is to say players showing up for their tests, not just players, coaches, and staffs showing up for tests every day and being honest about where they've been off campus. And this is a particularly critical point in the calendar. Not only is it deep in the season, but people have just had families over and friends over for Thanksgiving. And so exposures are even higher than they normally would be. And in this case, the 3 Broncos quarterbacks who were exposed to the 4th quarterback who tested positive were not forthcoming about being in meeting rooms with him, not wearing their masks, not wearing their tracking devices, and so forth. So the honor code went off the rails in this case. And the second thing is that at this point in the season, there's always been a risk that the players in the closest proximity to each other would all go out at once. And we had another instance of this a few weeks back on the Las Vegas Raiders, where one player on the offensive line tested positive, and then everybody else was sitting in the meeting room with him and had close contact and also had to isolate for 5 days. In that case, those players had enough time on the schedule to make it to Sunday and play. In this case, it happened so late in the week that the quarterbacks had to sit out. So the honor code was broken, and the NFL sort of worst case scenario of entire position groups going out came to fruition.
Right. I want to come back to the honor code in just a second. One of the other strange paradoxes here is that the same disease which causes the problem, COVID-19, also makes it very hard to get a different player in if you're having a crisis. And we should mention that for people who don't follow football, I mean, these teams, they typically have rooms dedicated to various positions. So there's kind of a receiver's room. There's a quarterback's room where they meet during the week and talk about stuff. And that's sort of what you're saying, that you get all 4 quarterbacks in one room. If one of them is positive, everybody's in danger. But the other problem is you can't sign somebody because they've got to go through a protracted, what is it, a 5-day protocol?
Well, they can play on the 6th day or take part in activities on the 6th. Yeah, so they couldn't on a Saturday when this was all disclosed. There was no time to sign somebody off another roster or a free agent. That was not possible.
So, in terms of the honor code, maybe you could say a little bit more about how that's all working out. I mean, it has to work within a team. The players have to be honest and forthright within the context of the team. And then the teams, I assume, have to be honest with the league itself. And there have been some fairly large fines and penalties handed out, I think, when the league felt that wasn't happening. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so the NFL opted, unlike the NBA and NHL, which constructed essentially their entire league inside a community, a closed community. In the case of the NBA down in Orlando, where they took over a bunch of hotels and staggered the practices and games so that the players could come and go and they could finish their season and into the playoffs. The NFL opted not to do that. They went sort of the way baseball went, which was when you're in the clubhouse, when you're in the stadium, when you're around your teammates on the team bus and so forth, it's pretty tightly controlled. But once you leave the facility, you're on your own. And that's where the honor code comes in. And, in most cases, the NFL, the facilities themselves are very well run. They have testing every single day. The lockers are now spaced out from each other, so there's 6 feet. The weight room is used in a staggered format, so not everybody's close to each other. The players are supposed to wear masks and so forth. That's fine. At the end of the day, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, they all drive home. And what the NFL has found early in the season is that, in fact, most players that got COVID or ended up testing positive weren't going out to clubs or restaurants, this sort of worst case scenario of people being reckless. They actually just went home and were exposed to their families. And in the case of some players, they were exposed to nannies, helpers at home who are, again, another layer out and working in the real world, so to speak. And so most of it was benign. And they didn't have massive outbreaks because groups of players weren't doing things recklessly together. Now it's gotten deep enough in the season, and there is so much community spread in so many cities. Nobody's immune from them anymore. Remember, of course, it started in the Northeast where we are, and in Southern California in pockets. Then there was the summer wave a lot in the South, but now it's everywhere. And there's no city or town or NFL city that's exempt from any of this.
Watching the games, I'm simultaneously, as I'm sure you are, grateful to have the NFL around, and at a time when we're all looking for diversions, I like to be able to watch the games. But when I watch the games, it also seems as though I'm watching people who don't take this fully seriously. Or I guess what I mean by this is you look at the sidelines and, most of the players are wearing masks, which they're supposed to be. But watching Chicago versus Green Bay last night, I see Aaron Rodgers run off the field. He doesn't really put on a mask. He goes over to talk to his coach, Matt LaFleur, who is masked. They're face to face. Rodgers isn't masked. Watching them on the field, of course, the players are often very, very close together and talking to one another, sometimes talking to the other team, sometimes to each other. It seems like a lot of the strategy is based on an almost experimental belief that being outdoors is incredibly safe, which virologists would tell you, I think, well, no, it's not 100% safe. It's just a lot safer than indoors. I don't know what question I'm asking exactly. Except that, do you get that same feeling as you're watching this, that, wow, it's amazing that they don't have more spread?
Well, that would make sense, and I have had exactly the same thought, except that these players are tested every single day, and including on game day, which was something they started once the season was underway. And it always shocked me that they didn't start on game day, since that's when they're going to meet 50 other players from another city. So, but they have tightened the rules now. So you could argue that the 50 players you're seeing on the Packers and the 50 players on the Bears are perhaps the most watched players or monitored players around, including their coaches, because they all go through the same protocols, and they travel on these team planes together, and there's no exposure to, I don't know, a chef in the bottom of the stadium, who cooked meals. It's now all grab and go. So in some ways, their players have all tested negative. It doesn't seem to make sense, because in the real world, that's not how it works. That you don't know, there's so much asymptomatic spread. But it still looks odd and disconsolate that this would be going on, this face-to-face contact. Only this last week did the NFL require the players themselves to wear masks when they're off the field. The coaches, of course, have had that for a while. But yes, it's a very jarring image, particularly given all the messaging we've told about, standing 6 feet away and so forth. And here are these players, arm in arm, face to face, talking to each other unmasked.
Ken Belson, does it feel to you like at this point the NFL is kind of rolling the dice here? In other words, they've had this somewhat scary weekend. We didn't even talk about the fact that the San Francisco 49ers are also facing the loss of the facility where they would typically play home games and maybe a practice facility too. But, I mean, more than that, you see the Denver situation, you see some of the other situations. There's a Tuesday night game that I think has been postponed twice. I mean, this could all kind of blow up in the NFL's face. And I guess I wonder, what do you think the consequences of that would be if the NFL turned out to have, over the last few weeks of its current season, the worst COVID-19 problem in professional sports? I don't know. What's the downside of that? How bad would things get for the league?
Well, I would argue that the league has been rolling the dice from the outset, but it had the benefit of watching the other leagues, baseball and hockey and so forth, complete their seasons and sort of picking and choosing the best techniques that they all used. And let's give credit where it's due. They've gotten through 12 weeks with only 2 major outbreaks, one in Tennessee and one in Baltimore, and a lot of isolated cases and obviously some very odd circumstances like in Denver. But they've gotten at week 12. If you remember in baseball, the Miami Marlins were down like within the first week or 10 days. Philadelphia, they had a whole cascade of them early in their season. So in some ways, the NFL has done quite well to get to 3/4 of their regular season without these dominoes all falling at once. And, frankly, the Baltimore, Denver, and San Francisco cases are all 3 separate cases. They're not knocking into each other, at least just yet. That's the first thing. The second thing is, they built in a lot of flexibility here. There was somebody who said the other day on Twitter, you can't televise a forfeit. The league's money, half of the league's revenue comes from television contracts, and another 1/4 of it comes from sponsorships and merchandise. So from their perspective, as long as the games are going on, they're still collecting paychecks. And by the way, the players are too. Nobody wants to forfeit games. So they're doing everything they can to get through some semblance of a season. Look, baseball had only 60 games. That's the ultimate asterisk. It wasn't even a full season. The NFL, in 3 years from now, people are not going to look back at 2020 statistics and go, well, yeah, that was the COVID year. Let's take 20% off of his statistics. They're just going to say it was another year. And I think they're doing as best they can under these circumstances. As long as they get to the Super Bowl, they'll feel like they've succeeded under pretty trying circumstances. But, again, to be seen, because they know that there's a lot of rough waters ahead. And they could push back and add another week to the season for makeup games to be played. They could end up with uneven results where one team has 15 games, another 16, and they've already addressed contingencies for that too. And frankly, they could push the Super Bowl back by several weeks into late February if they really had to. So there's a lot of room left on their list of worst case scenarios to run through.
I have so many other questions, but Betsy Kaplan informs me we have to stop, and I dare not gainsay her. Ken Belson covers the NFL for the New York Times. Thank you for joining us today.
Sure, pleasure.
And to the rest of you, thank you for joining us today as well. We will have more shows for you this week. We'll tell you all about them on the radio.